She's gone. The woman who commanded 450 million Europeans, who brought the biggest corporations on the planet to their knees, who survived every scandal, every inquiry, every demand for accountability for 6 straight years, just walked to that microphone in the European Parliament and said the words that Brussels never believed it would hear. Ursula von der Leyen has resigned. Not forced out quietly through a backroom deal, not eased into a dignified exit with a farewell dinner and a commemorative plaque, resigned live in front of the full chamber, in front of the cameras, in front of the entire world. And the moment those words left her mouth, something happened in that room that no one who was present will ever forget for the rest of their lives. To understand what happened in that chamber today, you have to understand what it actually took to get here. Because this did not happen overnight, and it did not happen because the system worked the way it was supposed to. The European Union spent 6 years protecting Ursula von der Leyen from consequences that would have ended any other political career on the continent within 12 months. 6 years of deleted messages, buried inquiries, procedural obstruction, and institutional silence, while the evidence against her piled up in Belgian courtrooms, ombudsmen filing cabinets, and the locked offices of MEPs who had been quietly building a case that Brussels told them would never matter. Today, it mattered. Today, everything they built came due at once. And the woman who had operated for half a decade with absolute confidence that accountability did not apply to her discovered in the most public and permanent way possible that she was wrong. The sequence of events that produced this resignation did not begin this morning. It began the moment Romanian MEP Christian Terez placed those documents on the screen behind her in that earlier parliamentary session and watched the color drain from her face in front of 705 elected representatives and a live broadcast that reached tens of millions of European citizens simultaneously. That session cracked the foundation. What happened in the weeks that followed finished the structure entirely, because once those documents were public, once the evidence that the Pfizer Procurement Committee had been deliberately bypassed at her personal direction was visible to every journalist, every opposition government, and every MEP who had been sitting on the fence, waiting to see which direction the political wind was actually blowing, the protection that had kept her untouchable for years began dissolving in real time, and there was nothing her legal team, her communications apparatus, or her allies inside the European People's Party could do to stop it. The Belgian court case moved faster than anyone expected. The judges presiding over the ongoing criminal inquiry into the Pfizer contract had been watching the parliamentary session. They had seen the same documents on the same screen. And 3 days after that session, the Belgian Federal Prosecutor's Office issued a formal statement confirming that the scope of their investigation had been expanded to include potential criminal liability for the deliberate destruction of official procurement communications. That was not a procedural update. That was a message. When a federal prosecutor in the country where the European Commission is headquartered publicly confirms that a sitting commission president is within the expanded scope of a criminal investigation, the political mathematics of protecting that president changes instantly and permanently. Inside the European People's Party, the phone calls started within hours. Not public statements, not press releases, phone calls. The kind that happen between senior party figures who need to communicate clearly without anything being recorded or quoted. The message moving through those calls was the same message that moves through every major political institution in the world. When the numbers stop working in your favor, she has to go. Not because they had suddenly developed a moral objection to everything she had done, not because the same people who had shielded her through Pfizergate and Sofagate and every other scandal had experienced a sudden awakening about accountability and transparency, but because the Belgian prosecutors had just changed the calculation entirely. Protecting a commission president from parliamentary censure was manageable politics. Protecting a commission president from an active criminal investigation being conducted by a sovereign member state's federal judiciary was a different category of problem altogether. And everyone in those phone calls understood exactly what category they were now in. The censure vote count, which had been moving slowly for weeks as MEPs quietly calculated their positions, accelerated overnight. The threshold for a formal censure motion required a 2/3 majority of votes cast and an absolute majority of MEPs. For years, that number had been the wall that made von der Leyen untouchable. Her allies could always hold enough votes to stay below it. But the Belgian prosecutor's announcement shattered that wall because it changed the question every undecided MEP was asking themselves. The question was no longer whether supporting censure would damage their relationship with the EP leadership. The question was now whether failing to support censure would associate them permanently with a president under criminal investigation in a case involving $35 billion of public money. That is a completely different political calculation, and it produced a completely different result. By the time the chamber convened for the session that would become the most watched parliamentary broadcast in European Union history, the internal vote count that van der Leyen's own team had been tracking showed the numbers had crossed the threshold, not by a small margin, not by the kind of razor-thin count that could be flipped with last-minute pressure and late-night promises. The count showed the votes for censure had exceeded the required threshold by a margin large enough that no amount of lobbying, deal-making, or political arm-twisting in the remaining hours could reverse it. Someone inside her inner circle told her what the numbers showed. The question was whether she would stand there and let the vote happen, let the formal record of European history show that the European Parliament had censured her by a supermajority, or whether she would do the one thing that no Commission president had ever done before. She chose the one thing no one had ever done before. And the reason she chose it, the specific calculation that produced the decision to resign publicly rather than absorb the censure vote, is a story involving one document that her legal team had spent the previous 72 hours doing everything in their power to keep out of that chamber. They failed. And the moment she was informed it had already been distributed to every MEP's official inbox, she made the call. So what was in that document? And why was the woman who had stared down Elon Musk, survived SoFi Gate, outlasted every inquiry, and governed 450 million people for 6 years so completely undone by a single file that she chose resignation over the fight she had always been confident she could win? The document that broke Ursula von der Leyen was not a leak. It was not a whistleblower acting out of conscience or a disgruntled commission insider settling a personal score. It was a court-ordered disclosure produced under a Belgian judicial compulsion order that her legal team had been fighting in 3 separate procedural challenges for 11 consecutive months. 11 months of motions, appeals, and jurisdictional arguments specifically designed to keep one file locked inside a Brussels evidence vault where no MEP, no journalist, and no European citizen would ever be able to read what was inside it. The Belgian judges rejected the final appeal at 6:47 in the morning on the day of the parliamentary session. By 8:15, the document had been formally transmitted to the European Parliament's official records office. By 9:30, it had been distributed to every MEP's inbox. By the time van der Leyen's motorcade was pulling into the Parliament complex, every elected representative in that chamber had already read it. She walked into that room knowing that. She walked in knowing that 705 people sitting in those seats had spent the previous hour reading the single most damaging document ever produced in connection with her presidency, and that there was no version of the next several hours that ended with her political position intact. The document was an internal communication audit conducted by the European Commission's own legal service in late 2022, commissioned quietly and buried immediately after its conclusions were finalized. The audit had been ordered by senior commission lawyers who were growing privately alarmed about the legal exposure created by the deletion of the Pfizer text messages and needed to understand internally how deep the problem actually ran. What the audit found was far worse than even the most pessimistic commission lawyer had anticipated. The deletion of the messages between van der Leyen and Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla was not an isolated incident of poor record-keeping. The audit documented a systematic pattern across multiple major procurement processes during the pandemic period in which official communications conducted through personal devices had been routinely excluded from the mandatory archiving systems that EU transparency law required. The Pfizer negotiation was the largest and most consequential, but it was not the only one. The audit identified 4 additional procurement processes involving a combined total of over 8 billion euros of European taxpayer money in which the Commission's own legal service could not confirm that complete communication records existed because personal device communications had never been captured in the official archive. That finding meant the Pfizer situation was not a mistake. It was not carelessness. It was a method, a deliberate operational approach to conducting major financial negotiations through channels that existed entirely outside the institutional record-keeping systems that EU law and European taxpayers' right to transparency demanded. The Commission's own lawyers had put that conclusion in writing in an internal document in 2022, immediately classified it, and buried it in a file that was supposed to remain permanently inaccessible. The Belgian court had just made it permanently accessible to everyone. The paragraph on page 7 of that audit that every MEP read over their morning coffee was 11 lines long, and it stated in the formal, precise, deliberately unemotional language of institutional legal analysis that the communication practices documented in this review are inconsistent with the Commission's obligations under EU transparency regulation and represent a structural departure from the accountability standards that govern the exercise of executive power under the founding treaties of the European Union. 11 lines written by the Commission's own lawyers about their own president, stating in language that required no interpretation and permitted no spin that what she had been doing was structurally wrong, institutionally illegal, and a fundamental violation of the foundational rules of the union she had been appointed to lead. When the session opened and the chamber president called the room to order, the atmosphere was unlike anything that veteran parliamentary observers had experienced in decades of covering European institutions. The noise was not the usual procedural chaos of competing agendas and partisan positioning. It was the specific, focused, almost electric tension of a room full of people who all knew that something irreversible was about to happen and were waiting for the moment it began. Van der Leyen entered from the side corridor and walked to the commission bench without making eye contact with anyone in the chamber. Her posture was controlled. Her expression was the same composed, neutral mask she had worn through every previous confrontation. But the people who had covered her for years and knew how to read the specific language of her body under pressure saw something different this time. The composure was not confidence. It was the controlled stillness of someone managing an internal state that was the opposite of calm, holding the surface together through sheer professional discipline while everything underneath it had already come apart. Christian Terres did not wait for procedural niceties. He had the floor within the first 12 minutes of the session, and he used it with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this moment and was not going to waste a single second of it. He did not represent the procurement documents from the previous session. He did not repeat the arguments the entire chamber already knew. He went directly to the audit. He read the 11 lines from page 7 out loud into the parliamentary record in a chamber so quiet that the sound of his voice carried to every corner without amplification. He then looked directly at Van der Leyen sitting at the commission bench and asked her one question. He asked her whether she had personally ordered the classification and suppression of that audit after reading its conclusions in 2022. The chamber went absolutely silent. Not the chaotic silence of a room waiting to explode, but the deep, complete silence of a room that had just understood that the answer to that question, whatever it was, would end a presidency. She did not answer the question. What she did instead in the next 4 minutes was the political equivalent of confirming everything. She began a prepared statement about the Commission's commitment to transparency and institutional accountability, using the language her communications team had drafted for exactly this scenario. And the chamber let her speak for approximately 90 seconds before the reaction began. But it was not the shouting of the previous session. It was something more controlled and, in many ways, more devastating. It was laughter, not universal laughter, not mockery from the opposition benches alone, but the specific, incredulous, exhausted laughter of people who had been listening to institutional non-answers for years and had finally completely run out of patience for them. When members of your own political family are laughing at your prepared statement about transparency while a court-disclosed document proving the opposite sits open on their screens, there is no communication strategy in existence that recovers that moment. And that was the moment in that laughter that the decision was made. What happened in the next 18 minutes before she stood up and made the announcement that stopped Europe cold is a sequence of events that reveals exactly how power collapses when it finally collapses, and why the people who were certain she would fight until the very end got it so completely wrong. She stood up without being recognized by the chamber president. That alone violated parliamentary procedure. That alone told everyone in the room what was coming before a single word left her mouth. The prepared statement her communications team had drafted for the censure scenario was sitting on the bench in front of her, untouched. She did not look at it. She did not look at her aides. She looked at the chamber, at the 705 elected representatives who had spent the morning reading the document her lawyers had spent 11 months trying to bury. And she spoke for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. No notes, no prepared language, no institutional framing about ongoing legal processes and commitment to transparency. She said that she had dedicated her career to the European project and believed in its founding principles. She said that the Commission's credibility and the Parliament's authority could not coexist with the cloud that the disclosed documents had placed over her continued leadership. And then she said the 6 words that froze the entire chamber into absolute silence. She said she was tendering her resignation immediately. The silence lasted 4 seconds, 4 seconds in which 705 politicians, dozens of journalists, and millions of people watching on live broadcasts across 27 nations processed what they had just heard. And then the chamber erupted in a way that had no historical precedent in the entire 70-year history of European parliamentary democracy. Not in celebration, not in triumph, but in the raw, uncontrollable release of an institution that had spent 6 years holding its breath, waiting for accountability to mean something, and had just discovered, in the most public moment imaginable, that it finally did. Outside the Parliament building, the crowds that had gathered following weeks of protests in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw received the news on their phones simultaneously. The reactions were filmed from 100 different angles and within the hour had been seen by hundreds of millions of people who had never watched a European parliamentary session in their lives but had been waiting for exactly this moment without knowing it was actually possible. The 2 million signatures on the resignation petitions had not been enough. The Ombudsman findings had not been enough. The parliamentary questions and the procedural complaints and the years of documented evidence had not been enough on their own. But together, accumulated over years by people who refused to accept that accountability was permanently out of reach, they had built the case that a Belgian court finally forced into the open, and that a chamber full of elected representatives finally had no choice but to act on. Ursula von der Leyen walked out of the European Parliament for the last time as Commission President at 1:43 in the afternoon. The European Union she leaves behind is not the same institution she took over in 2019. The question now is what comes next, who fills the vacuum she leaves, and whether the forces that finally brought her down are strong enough to ensure that what she built in the shadows is dismantled permanently. Because the resignation is not the end of this story. The Belgian criminal investigation continues with a new and expanded target list. The 4 additional procurement processes identified in the buried audit are now fully public and fully under scrutiny. And somewhere in Brussels tonight, the people who enabled her, protected her, and made the calls that kept her untouchable for 6 years are looking at their phones and understanding that the protection she provided them in return has just permanently expired. Subscribe right now, because the next video covers exactly who those people are, what they authorized, and why the resignation you just watched may turn out to be only the first one.